There is perhaps no greater story in the Cold War than that of the space race. The mental image that is conjured is one of two sides in frantic competition to achieve landmark, although somewhat arbitrary, and certainly not mutually agreed on, goals. Although the space race is often seen as the greatest scientific competition ever waged, a new battlefield in a war of ideology, the greatest achievement that the space race possibly accomplished was the furtherance of international cooperation and détente. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the path taken from the fear created by Sputnik all the way to a handshake among the stars that transcended ideology. This is the Cold War. It is of great urgency and importance to our country, both from consideration of our prestige as a nation as well as military necessity, that this challenge, Sputnik, be met by an energetic program of research and development for the conquest of space. It is accordingly proposed that the scientific research be the responsibility of a national civilian agency. These are the words of Hugh Dryden, an American scientist and civil servant who few people have ever heard of, but who is also considered the founding father of what is perhaps the best known US government agency in the world, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Dryden published his statement on January 14, 1958, roughly 4 months after the Soviet Union had placed Sputnik, the first man-made satellite, into Earth orbit. Dryden at the time was the director of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, a government-funded research institute that had been established in 1915 to help push forward U.S. aeronautical research, which was then in its infancy. In his capacity as director, Dryden and others were lobbying the Eisenhower administration to create a national body to coordinate U.S. aeronautical and space research exploration, rather than keeping everything under the direction of the Department of Defense, where the Army, Navy, and Air Forces each ran programs running in parallel to each other and often feuding over things like funding. 15 days after Dryden's statement, the U.S. Jet Propulsion Laboratory, working with the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and its key scientist and totally not a Nazi, Wernher von Braun, launched the first American satellite, Explorer 1, using the Jupiter C rocket, Juno 1. America finally had a satellite in space, but this was a hollow victory. The Soviets had already launched the far larger and more sophisticated Sputnik 2 less than a month after their first satellite. An attempt to launch Explorer 1 in December 1957 aboard a US Navy-developed Vanguard rocket, which we discussed in a previous video, had ended in failure when the rocket blew up on the launch pad. Thus, in light of perceived Soviet superiority in scientific acumen and organizational ability, the Eisenhower administration was quite receptive to Dryden's arguments. Eisenhower's own scientific advisor, James Killian, had written a memo in December 1957 on the organizational alternatives for space research and development. This document essentially argued that while the military should continue to develop ballistic missile technology, the primary lead in space exploration should be a civilian-led research agency which would coordinate with the military. It's worth noting that Killian was a critic of Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigation of the scientific community and would later state that actions by the military, under the guise of rooting out suspected communists, including revoking the security clearance of the father of the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, had a chilling effect on scientific research in the US as a whole. One would think Eisenhower, himself a career military man you will recall, would side with the military, but well, you would be wrong. Eisenhower, although a believer in a strong military, was skeptical of the military's ability to effectively manage research and development programs. Based on this, in April 1958, Eisenhower delivered an address to the US Congress calling for the NACA to be reformed as NASA and given primacy in coordinating all US space programs. The military would maintain their own programs, but these would become much more focused on the service branch's specific needs and benefit from NASA's overall research into rocketry in general. As a result of this shift, plans like the Air Force's LUNEX project, which had sought to establish a 21-man lunar base by 1968, or Project A119, another Air Force project which looked to test a nuclear bomb on the moon, were abandoned. In fact, the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which Eisenhower signed on July 29, 1958, expressly stipulated, quote, "The Congress hereby declares that it is the policy of the United States that activities in space should be devoted to peaceful purposes for the benefit of all mankind." Now, while the Americans reorganized their space program, the Soviet Union was already pressing ahead with their next major goal of space exploration, manned flight. Human spaceflight at the time was largely theoretical, and it was uncertain if living creatures could even survive the acceleration of a rocket launch. This question led to perhaps one of the saddest and certainly more ethically dubious experiments in spaceflight history. Remember when I mentioned Sputnik 2? Well, in addition to other scientific instruments, that craft carried a biological sample to test the ability of living things to survive both launch as well as orbit. The biological sample was a dog christened Laika. She had been a stray picked up in the streets of Moscow. Soviet scientists believed that Moscow strays were particularly hardy animals since they lived in a city that saw extreme temperature fluctuations. Having myself once adopted a stray from the streets of that city, I can agree that they are wonderfully adaptable, but no creature should have been deliberately subjected to what came next. Laika took flight on November 3, 1957, and although the capsule contained food and water, there was no plan to recover the spacecraft. Laika was expected to die in orbit, and indeed sadly she did after 4 days, likely from overheating as some of the capsule's insulation had torn loose during takeoff, raising the interior temperature to over 40 degrees Celsius. Laika's sad story exemplifies how ethical considerations are often put aside in the pursuit of rapid technological advancement. Oleg Gazenko, the Soviet scientist who selected and trained Laika late in his own life, expressed deep regret at how she was used by the Soviet space program. Laika was commemorated in the Soviet Union, appearing on stamps and even the Soviet Conquerors of Space monument, and she continues to be honored by the scientific community at large. Despite the cruelty of the method, Laika's flight did prove that living things could survive in space, and as a result, both the United States and the Soviet Union aggressively pushed ahead with their manned rocket program. After much deliberation, both sides settled on recruiting pilots, usually military pilots, for their astronaut and cosmonaut programs, respectively. The Americans specifically chose to recruit test pilots, men who had already shown a willingness to climb into untested aircraft, which was a good decision because the American rocket program was facing a number of issues. As NASA was getting off the ground, it chose to adopt the US Army's Redstone rocket for its first manned flight. Problematically, however, a number of test launches failed spectacularly, leading many in the press and government to ask why American rockets always blew up, while Soviet rockets seemed to have no trouble launching into space. In actual fact, the Soviets did experience several launch failures, but the highly secretive Soviet space program only reported these successes. For the Soviet part, they were also busy creating a corps of would-be space explorers, opting for Soviet Air Force pilots because these men were seen as having the relevant experience and skill to successfully survive spaceflight and operate under high G forces. From a pool of 200 candidates, 20 were selected, and on June 29, 1960, the group moved to their new permanent base at Zeleny, now known as Star City, which remains the site of cosmonaut training to this day. Even as they recruited potential pilots, the Soviets were moving ahead rapidly with the development of their launch vehicle. The Vostok capsule was developed as a dual-use surveillance satellite named Zenit and as a manned launch vehicle. It was to be launched on a modified R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile known as the Vostok K. Dual use of military technology remained a critical aspect of securing Communist Party support for the space program. Soviet Premier Khrushchev, although mindful of the propaganda value of the space program, always had an eye on its military application and, despite some notable examples, largely let the program run autonomously, giving Sergei Korolyov a fairly free hand. Soviet scientists carried out a number of test flights, again containing biological samples, but this time designed to return to Earth. The most successful of these was on August 19, 1960, when a capsule carrying 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, 40 mice, 2 rats, and a wide assortment of plants launched and then returned to Earth after a day spent in orbit. Following this, on March 9, 1961, another successful launch tested the capsule with a full-size test dummy named Ivan Ivanovich, who was successfully ejected from the capsule upon its return to Earth. Yes, you did hear that right. In order to increase the likelihood the pilot would return safely, Vostok was designed for the pilot to eject while still 7 kilometers above the ground. The Americans, meanwhile, were beginning to catch up. 7 astronauts were selected, dubbed the Mercury 7, after the project named Mercury, and NASA was now pushing ahead with the Mercury Redstone rocket. A successful test launch on the 31st of January 1961 carried a chimpanzee named Ham into space and returned him safely. NASA continued to test the Mercury Redstone even as it worked with the American military and private industry to build more capable launch vehicles. Now, one of the advantages enjoyed by the Soviets was their higher tolerance for risk. With any potential failures out of the public eye, they could immediately use their intercontinental ballistic missiles as human launch vehicles. The US, however, was well aware that for the public, watching American astronauts being caught in an exploding rocket would be extremely unpopular and would seriously hurt US prestige as well as their ability to continue to secure political support and funding. So while NASA had selected the ICBM Atlas for its next iteration of rockets, the initial launch would need to be made on the by now far more reliable Redstone. The Redstone launch would be suborbital as opposed to orbital flight, as the pilot would fly past the Kármán line but then begin his descent rather than traveling around the Earth. Orbital flight would need to wait for the far more powerful Atlas rocket to undergo further testing. So, as the Americans refined their systems, the Soviets were ready to go. We should note here, though, that if their attempt to launch a man into orbit failed, they would merely try again. Indeed, the Soviets had already had their first casualty, Senior Lieutenant Valentin Bondarenko, who was killed on March 23, 1961, in a horrific training accident when a fire started in a pressure chamber. Bondarenko both burned to death and suffocated as the fire ate up all his oxygen in the chamber, while other staff watched helplessly, unable to open the door for half an hour due to the difference in air pressure. Bondarenko was 24 years old, the youngest of the cosmonauts. The Soviet government attempted to erase any record of Bondarenko, even removing him from official photographs. It would not be until the reforms of Glasnost that the full details of his death were brought to light. But Bondarenko's death and other setbacks did not deter the Soviets, and on April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin prepared to launch into orbit. The 27-year-old Gagarin had up to this point lived an eventful life. The son of collective farmers who resided in Gzhatsk near Smolensk, had survived the Nazi occupation and, after the war, apprenticed as a steelworker before joining the Air Force. Lieutenant General Nikolai Kamanin, who had overseen the Vostok training program, ranked Gagarin as the most capable candidate, and thus he was selected to be the first man in space. Gagarin was also deemed the most politically suitable, coming from the right background. Neither Gagarin nor Korolyov slept the night before the flight, but at 6:07 UTC, the Vostok's engines roared to life, and Korolyov radioed Gagarin good luck, to which Gagarin replied some version of "Поехали, let's go." It took 10 minutes for the craft to reach orbit, and after a roughly 45-minute trip around the world, the retro rockets fired and Gagarin began re-entry. His spacecraft, despite losing radio contact, functioned as planned, and in southern Russia, near the small town of Engels, a young girl and her grandfather looked up to see a man in an orange jumpsuit descending via parachute. The man, after he landed, informed them he was a Soviet citizen and needed to find a telephone to call Moscow. Gagarin's and the Soviet Union's success captivated the world. The United States, caught in second place again, rapidly pushed ahead with its own planned launch, and on May 5, 1961, less than a month after Gagarin's flight, Alan Shepard, a former naval aviator and test pilot, launched from the new U.S. primary launch site at Cape Canaveral, Florida, aboard the Mercury Redstone 3, christened Freedom 7. The flight lasted 15 minutes, 22 seconds, and the first spacecraft traveled 486 kilometers from its launch point, touching down in the Atlantic Ocean. America had put a man in space, but it would be another 8 months before the first American orbited the Earth. The Soviets launched a follow-up mission to Gagarin's flight on August 6, 1961, Vostok 2, flown by German Titov, to show that their manned launches were repeatable. The US also launched a follow-up suborbital flight on July 21, 1961, flown by Virgil Ivan Gus Grissom. This mission illustrated the risk of splashdown landings when the capsule, due to a misstep by Grissom, sank. Grissom managed to exit the capsule before this happened and was rescued, but it was a close-run thing. Finally, on February 20, 1962, after another series of test flights, John Glenn, a former Marine aviator, launched aboard the Mercury Atlas 6 to the cry of "Godspeed, John Glenn," offered over the radio by his backup, Scott Carpenter. Glenn's more powerful Atlas rocket roared into the heavens, achieving 3 orbits around the Earth before safely returning, splashing down in the North Atlantic. So it was that less than 60 years after the first powered aircraft had been borne aloft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, humans had truly slipped the surly bonds of Earth and danced above the clouds on wings of fire. But there was more yet to come as new goals were set, looking not at Earth's orbit, but Earth's closest celestial neighbor, the Moon, as well as beyond, to see what truly lay out in the darkness of space. For the United States, there was a singular goal, a challenge to the nation laid down by a new young president. But for the Soviet Union, there was no such singular task for them to work towards, no unifying goal. And this is where the argument comes from, that the race to the moon was a race with only one contestant, where the other supposed runner of the race was working towards something else. Now, that being said, on September 12, 1962, President John Kennedy gave a speech at Rice University in Houston. "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is the one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win." Of course, Kennedy would sadly not live to see whether or not the US space program rose to the challenge he laid out, as about a year later, in another Texas city, Kennedy would be struck dead by a lone gunman. Yet, before the end of that decade, an American would indeed set foot on the moon, creating one of the most iconic moments in human history. But how to go about doing this was unclear, both in terms of planning, but also in terms of its very practicality. Early lunar landing concepts like the Air Force's 1958 Lunex project used single-stage to orbit systems which would break Earth's gravity, land on the moon, and then return, all using a single rocket. This was found to be impractical as actual rocket science continued to develop from a largely theoretical to a practical discipline. NASA scientists began to develop mathematical formulas that allowed them to calculate how much fuel was required to get a man to the moon, and more importantly, bring him back from the moon. There is something worth directly mentioning here. Although NASA had begun to work with companies such as IBM to develop electronic computers to assist in calculations, much of the complex mathematics was done by hand and largely by women, called computers because they computed things. Most notable of these was Miss Katherine Johnson, an African-American woman working at NASA's offices in Virginia. Over her career, first with the NACA and then NASA, Johnson established a reputation of excellence, so much so that she was asked to verify the calculations of digital computers, and John Glenn, prior to his first launch, refused to fly until Johnson had signed off on the calculations. Johnson and her colleague's story is told in the 2017 movie Hidden Figures, in case all of this rings a bell, but you couldn't remember why. While electronic computers would grow more effective over time, employees like Johnson, many of them women and people of color, would make major contributions to the space program. As the US began to work through the theoretical requirements for a mission to the moon, it was established that 3 things were required. One was to test new concepts, including the ability to conduct an orbital rendezvous between 2 vehicles. The second was to develop a more powerful rocket. At this point, the US was still using rockets originally developed to launch missiles, which had the power to reach the Soviet Union, but a mission to the moon, or missions deeper into the cosmos, would need rockets designed for that purpose. The third identified necessity was to use unmanned craft to gain a better understanding of space, the moon, and destinations further beyond. In order to address the first set of challenges, the US began to utilize the ongoing Mercury and then Gemini programs as a testbed for new concepts, as well as a way to better understand a human's ability to work and live in space. Like the Soviets, the initial follow-up launch to the successful orbital flight of John Glenn, which saw US astronaut Scott Carpenter orbit the Earth in a similar manner, was designed to show the Mercury launches were repeatable. Following this, NASA launched longer and longer missions, with Gordon Cooper flying the final Mercury capsule on May 15, 1963, orbiting the Earth 22 times and spending a total of 1 day, 10 hours, 19 minutes, and 49 seconds in space. Mercury, having served its purpose, was rapidly supplanted by the Gemini program, which was able to launch 2 astronauts into orbit at once. It too became a testbed for new systems. Some notable milestones from the Gemini program included Gemini 3 on March 23, 1965, which was the first US spacecraft to change its orbit using thrusters. Gemini 4, which saw astronaut Ed White on June 3, 1965, become the first American to walk in space, a feat that came a few months after Alexei Leonov had accomplished the same task. Followed by Gemini 6A, 7, and 8, which practiced orbital rendezvous and docking. As a side note, these test flights were crucial to identify a number of issues. It was during Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 that NASA established spacecraft could not fly at each other like aircraft, but rather needed to calculate to adjust their orbits. Gemini 7, a 14-day endurance mission, also illustrated the shortcomings in NASA's design of the spacecraft plumbing. This was something Ed White had already noted when he prolonged his spacewalk far longer than was intended, simply because he didn't want to get back into the cramped capsule. The Gemini program only lasted for about 2 years, between 1964 and 1966, but helped lay the foundation for the manned moon missions, Project Apollo. And to carry Americans to the moon on the wings of Apollo, NASA was hard at work developing a new rocket, along with a whole family of systems to enable a crew to fly to the moon. The Saturn rocket family began its development at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, under the direction of Walt Disney's favorite, not a Nazi, Wernher von Braun. The Saturn rocket family was derived from earlier rockets developed for the US military, but it was different from its predecessors in that it was designed to primarily be a heavy lift vehicle, launching payloads into high Earth orbit or beyond Earth trajectories. The Saturn I's first test was on October 27, 1961, and development continued throughout the 1960s, with the first Saturn V rocket launching on November 9, 1967. It's worth noting that the testing of the Saturn V was greatly accelerated by NASA, especially the Deputy Director of Operations, George Mueller, who approved all-up testing, which allowed all stages of the Saturn V to be tested in parallel to each other rather than testing one at a time. In order to support the Apollo program, NASA was also expanding. It employed directly or indirectly over 400,000 people. It also expanded its launch infrastructure and constructed a ground control station in Houston, Texas. No problems yet, Houston. But Apollo wasn't the only iron in NASA's proverbial fire. Even as NASA astronauts were learning how to work in space, and the Saturn rocket and the rest of the Apollo components were undergoing development, NASA was pursuing a number of unmanned scientific missions and testing the efficacy of satellite communications. NASA had already begun unmanned exploration as early as 1958 with its Explorer program, which mainly focused on Earth satellites. Explorer was followed by the Pioneer program, which sought to explore the moon and other planetary bodies, and then the Mariner program, which was meant to send robotic probes to the inner solar system. We won't go through all these missions as it is quite lengthy, but suffice it to say, these missions, many done in cooperation with academic and international organizations, created massive amounts of new scientific data and helped to drive further developments in NASA's technology. This included the miniaturization of electronics, helping to reduce the overall mass of each payload, making it far easier to launch them into space and go further faster. Okay, so while all this was going on, you would expect that the Soviets would be hard at work on their own lunar program, trying to beat the Americans to the moon. This was a race after all, right? Well, you would in fact be wrong. As I mentioned earlier, the US took great pains to coordinate all the different facets of its space program into one guiding body. NASA, under the tenure of Director James Webb and George Mueller as the head of Office of Manned Spaceflight, zeroed in on the singular goal of a manned moon mission and then worked towards it. The Soviets, on the other hand, had never centralized their space program. Instead, a number of different design bureaus operated their own pet projects, and getting them to cooperate was rather like trying to herd cats. The driving force behind the Soviet space program was still Sergei Korolev, who had overseen the success of the Vostok program and continued to see successes, including Alexei Leonov's aforementioned spacewalk, as well as the launching of the first female cosmonaut, Valentina Tereshkova, during the Vostok 6 mission. Korolev was also the primary advocate for the direction of the Soviet space program, which he foresaw establishing a manned orbital space station and then landing a man on the moon. It took until 1964, however, for Korolev to convince the Soviet government to commit to this plan, well after the development of Apollo was underway. Soviet development was further slowed by political infighting and favoritism. Vladimir Chelomeny, an ally of Khrushchev, was given the task of developing a manned rocket to the moon, and his inexperience slowed the pace of production. The Soviets' goal was to land on the moon in 1968, the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, but the technology didn't look to be ready in time. Korolev persisted though, and with Khrushchev's fall in 1964, he was able to consolidate his authority as director of the manned Soviet program, although not the overall space industrial complex. But then tragedy struck. In 1966, Korolev underwent surgery but died 9 days later, suffering complications from colon cancer and heart disease. Without his driving force and vision, and lacking solid political buy-in, the Soviet program began to suffer, and nowhere was this more evident than the development of the Soviet lunar rocket. The N-1, like the Saturn V, was designed to be a super heavy lift vehicle, but development, which had begun in 1956, did not really begin in earnest until 1965 and was then hampered by technical problems. This included a debate over what kind of fuel to use, as some Soviet designers advocated utilizing hypergolic fuel, which was easier to store and ignite, but extremely toxic. Vasily Mishin replaced Korolev as head of the OKB-1 Design Bureau, but lacked his predecessor's knowledge, authority, and leadership skills. The N-1 continued to suffer problems, and although it was tested 4 times, it never actually flew. Moreover, Mishin, under pressure to push ahead with space exploration, approved the launch of the new Soyuz spacecraft without it having been fully tested, resulting in the death of Vladimir Komarov. After this incident, Mishin developed a severe drinking problem, and most Soviet plans for a manned mission to the moon never made it off the drawing board, which in the long run may have actually been the best for everyone. In an effort to catch up to the Americans, the Soviets had planned to launch a 2-man spacecraft with a single-seat lunar lander that a cosmonaut would spacewalk to. You can imagine the number of things that could go wrong, especially as the cosmonaut was expected to repeat the process upon redocking with the craft while also hauling lunar soil and rock samples. The Soviet lunar program would be quietly cancelled in 1976, though it had never really been feasible after the failure of the N-1. Instead of pursuing a lunar program then, the Soviets pushed ahead with the development of the Soyuz capsule and unmanned probes. Though most of these programs, like the Venera missions, would not come to greater prominence until later, the secrecy of the overall Soviet program gave the impression the race was still underway, even if it wasn't really a race at all. But back on the other side of the Atlantic and Pacific, not everything was going swimmingly with the American program either. On February 21st, 1967, what was supposed to be a dress rehearsal for Apollo's first manned orbital flight ended in tragedy when a fire in the cabin of the Apollo spacecraft killed American astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee. Tragically, the astronauts might have survived had the ground crew been able to rapidly open the sealed hatch. The fire led to a 20-month delay in the Apollo program and the development of new safety systems and safety protocols, including things like explosive bolts. Yet, NASA pushed ahead, and between December 21st and 27th of 1968, Apollo 8 became the first American spacecraft to leave low Earth orbit and conduct a successful flyby of the moon, although they did create a bit of controversy over the reading of the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis as they did so. Incidentally, the Soviets had beaten the Americans to be the first to circle the moon with living creatures and then have them return safely to Earth. The September 1968 Zond 5 mission sent a pair of tortoises named number 22 and number 37 around the moon and then back home again. Apollo 8 and other test missions proved the viability of Apollo's complex flight plan. The rocket would launch, enter orbit, turn and rendezvous with their lunar lander module called the LEM, and then fly to the moon, where it would detach the LEM, which would land. After a short stay on the moon, the astronauts would lift off from the LEM and rendezvous and dock with the command module, and the astronauts would return to Earth. That is a very basic way of putting it, and at every step, there was the potential for mission failure due to both human and mechanical error. Still, Apollo 10 successfully accomplished each of these steps, short of lunar descent and landing, in May 1969. On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11, with the crew of Neil Armstrong, Edwin Eugene Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, successfully entered lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin descended in the LEM, and in one of the most watched moments of television history, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. Speaking out loud the words we all know so well, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For an amazing step-by-step breakdown of the Apollo 11 mission, I highly recommend the BBC World Service podcast, 13 Minutes to the Moon. So, the Americans had seemingly won the space race. The question then became, well, what next? Well, Apollo missions continued, but faced some difficulties. Apollo 12, which launched November 16, 1969, was struck by lightning, causing a severe electrical short and almost caused the astronauts to abort their mission. However, one flight controller, John Aaron, calmly gave the astronauts instructions on how to correct the problem, earning Aaron the coolest title one can ever achieve, Steely-Eyed Missile Man. And Aaron needed those nerves again when, in April 1970, Apollo 13 suffered a severe malfunction, later determined to be an explosion in an oxygen tank. Apollo 13 wasn't able to land on the moon, but NASA, with the whole world watching, successfully brought its 3 astronauts home safely. Apollo 13 illustrated the potential dangers of space flight, but also the seemingly diminishing return on investment the Apollo program was having. Apollo 13, incidentally, also resulted in a fantastic 1995 Tom Hanks movie of the same title, which is well worth watching even today. The Saturn V rocket, the rocket that took men to the moon, was a magnificent machine, but it was extremely complex, with its massive stages manufactured in 3 different locations across the US before being shipped to Florida for final assembly before launch. The Nixon administration, eager to cut costs, had already begun to encourage NASA to invest in less expensive spacecraft, even though this would mean abandoning the moon. Ultimately, 12 humans would walk on the moon, and their journey would spark our collective imaginations, but also give us greater appreciation for our place in the universe. One photo of Apollo 11 taken by Michael Collins shows the LEM Eagle ascending towards the command module with Earth in the background. Collins would later remark how strange it was when he realized every person who existed or had ever existed was in front of him except himself. Now, we should talk about the politics of space, because yes, there is politics even in space, or about space in this case. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, at the start of the space race, there were efforts by both sides to militarize. Like so many things during the Cold War, both sides viewed it as a means to demonstrate the superiority of their system of capitalist democracy or Marxist-Leninism, depending on which side of the curtain you happen to be on. However, that doesn't mean that the nations or leaders saw the space race as a zero-sum game. Rather, both sides recognized the potential utility of space and the shared interest in keeping it largely demilitarized. As we've seen, the Eisenhower administration was keen to ensure the US space program was civilian-led, and Congress passed legislation to this effect. The USSR, while continuing to award funding to design bureaus for space projects that had military applications, also refrained from putting the space program under formal military control. Additionally, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union remained cordial, with both sides publicly congratulating each other on their achievements. This set the tone for the diplomatic reaction to Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961. First, Nikita Khrushchev sought to frame Gagarin's flight as a triumph, not just of communism, but of all humankind. His American counterpart, John F. Kennedy, responded by sending a telegram to Khrushchev congratulating him on Gagarin's flight and telling Khrushchev it was his sincere desire that in the continuing quest for knowledge of outer space, our nations can work together to obtain the greatest benefit to mankind. These discussions from leaders were not just platitudes either. They led to substantive talks. Negotiations were launched between Hugh Dryden, representing NASA, and Anatoly Blagoravov, who spoke for the Soviet Academy of Sciences, looking to share data and information between their respective space programs. These talks, which began in 1962, continued even during the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dryden and Blagoravov were among those who saw science as being outside of politics, and they ultimately concluded an agreement for the US and USSR to share information in medical science and satellite meteorological data. In practice, this allowed for results of studies on human and other living things in space to be openly published in scientific journals and discussed at scientific conferences. The same held true for meteorological data, which allowed for development of the first weather satellites to continue unimpeded and for their forecasts to be shared internationally. Now, all of this may sound fairly benign, but considering the depths of both Soviet and American Cold War paranoia and the potentially highly destructive military applications for space, the fact that even at this early stage, both governments were willing to explore avenues for cooperation is massively significant. Back to President Kennedy, we already mentioned his famous 1962 Rice University address, the one where he challenged America to go to the moon. But in 1963, Kennedy, addressing the UN General Assembly, suggested that a lunar expedition might be a joint US-Soviet operation. Sadly, Kennedy's death in 1963 ended that avenue of exploration, but the Johnson and then the Nixon administrations continued to explore high-level cooperation with the Soviets. The reasons for this are myriad and often incredibly complex, but simply, both sides recognized the enormous propaganda value of space, but also the potential for competition to spiral into an uncontrolled arms race. There was already one of those on the ground, so another arms race, which neither side could win or afford, and if war ever broke out would likely destroy all life on Earth, seemed like a step too far. So negotiations continued. Dryden and Blagoravov kept meeting and established a Memorandum of Understanding in 1964. The UN banned weapons of mass destruction from space in 1963. In 1967, both the US and USSR became sponsors to the Outer Space Treaty, which among its key provisions are 1. The exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. 2. States shall not place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies, or station them in outer space in any other manner. And 3. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, prohibits their use for testing weapons of any kind, conducting military maneuvers, or establishing military bases, installations, and fortifications. In effect, the Outer Space Treaty establishes space as neutral territory, which can be explored and possibly developed, but should remain demilitarized. This agreement was followed a year later by the Rescue Agreement, which made it obligatory for any nation to report a spacecraft in distress and render assistance if they were able. This mirrored long-established agreements and conventions that anyone who sees someone in distress at sea is required to do all they are able to render aid. Okay, so even as the moon landing approached, the US and the Soviet Union were discussing cooperation in space and sharing scientific information. Most of this was public, but didn't detract from the idea of a space race, a vital competition. Indeed, both the US and USSR were open about their competition with each other, but both had an interest in ensuring that it remained peaceful and abided by international rules and conventions.
This is not to say that both sides were not willing to use space for unarmed military purposes. Both the US and the Soviets began to develop spy satellites as early as 1955 and continued to develop them even as the Outer Space Treaty came into force. The utility of spy satellites is one reason why the Outer Space Treaty does not explicitly forbid all military activity in space, and to be fair, the US as early as Eisenhower argued that the ability of nations to maintain mutual observation would lower the risk of conflict. Thus, the US and the Soviets kept launching satellites even while neither side would acknowledge their existence. As a side note, conventional weapons were not banned from space either, in part because Soviet cosmonauts carried shotguns in their survival kits. The weapons were present in order to allow cosmonauts to survive in the Siberian wilderness until they could be rescued. This was the result of the 1965 Voskhod 2 mission veering off course and landing in Siberia, and mission commander Alexei Leonov being very concerned the pistols the cosmonauts carried would be insufficient to deal with Siberian wolves, tigers, and bears. The shotgun may also have helped if a random xenomorph was encountered, but probably not.
After the Apollo landings, the US and USSR continued to pursue space cooperation. For NASA, this was welcome as the Nixon administration was looking to cut costs and thus reduce NASA's budget. Being an avenue for international and superpower cooperation helped to keep the agency relevant. Astronauts and cosmonauts launched mutual goodwill tours, and Soviet and American scientists visited each other's facilities. In October 1970, Robert Gilruth, director of the Manned Spaceflight Center, entered into an agreement with his Soviet counterparts to develop a universal docking adapter. This is the same unit that is now standard on all manned spacecraft. A year later, the US-USSR Working Group on Space Biology and Medicine met for the first time, followed up with another meeting the next year. These discussions ultimately resulted in the 1972 bilateral treaty between the US and Soviets on agreement concerning cooperation in the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes. Both sides agreed as early as 1971 to undertake a joint mission where an Apollo spacecraft would dock to a Soyuz spacecraft and the astronaut and cosmonaut would shake hands in a symbolic gesture. As these talks were underway, both space programs were examining more sustainable missions. The US was exploring Skylab, and the Soviets were beginning to develop their own space station with Salyut. Both were developed using the Universal Docking System, even though neither ever hosted visiting astronauts or cosmonauts. These design principles illustrated that both sides had a mentality of planning for long-term cooperation. The Apollo-Soyuz mission, known officially as Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, came to fruition in July of 1975. American astronauts Thomas Stafford, Vance Brand, and Deke Slayton, and Soviet cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov docked their spacecrafts in orbit on July 17. Stafford and Leonov shook hands on live television. The Soviets read statements from Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev and received a phone call from US President Gerald Ford. The spacecraft remained docked for 44 hours, during which time the astronauts and cosmonauts undertook joint scientific experiments, exchanged gifts, and listened to each other's music, including Tenderness by Maya Kristalinskaya and Why Can't We Be Friends by War. Due to American Commander Stafford's thick Oklahoma accent, Leonov later said jokingly that there were 3 languages spoken on the mission: Russian, English, and Oklahomsky. Another notable aspect of the mission was that Leonov and Slayton had entered their respective astronaut corps at the same time, with Slayton being one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, but due to medical reasons, this was Slayton's only spaceflight and the last flight of an Apollo spacecraft. The 2 vehicles undocked successfully and remained in orbit for several more days, carrying out their respective experiments. The joint venture was criticized at the time, especially in the US, as being too deferential to the Soviets and contributing to a growing American malaise, largely driven by a failure in Vietnam, as well as Watergate, which would see significant pushback against US policy of cooperation. The Apollo-Soyuz mission not only gave birth to a terrible brand of cigarettes, but also marked what is considered by many as the high watermark of détente. However, despite the politics, US and Soviet space cooperation would ultimately remain largely intact. American space shuttles would visit the Mir space station, and despite some experimentation, neither side would break the Outer Space Treaty or other agreements.
Despite the struggles and competition, the space race was in fact one avenue throughout the Cold War where the two primary competitors found more room for mutual cooperation. The attitude of the superpowers was perhaps best captured by American physicist Carl Sagan, who, upon viewing an image of Earth known as the pale blue dot photo, captured by the Voyager 1 spacecraft at a distance of 29,400 kilometers, would say, "From this distant vantage point, the Earth might not seem of any particular interest, but for us, it's different. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam."
Space exploration served as a romantic and heroic source of propaganda, but also contributed major engineering and logistical challenges. Neither the United States or USSR saw space as a place to dominate, but rather recognized that their respective positions would be best served by contributing to a shared understanding for all humankind. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure to press the subscribe button and the bell button, which will result in it being launched into space on top of a 363-foot rocket weighing almost 3 million kilos. Fly, bell button, fly. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.